Hey everyone, welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving into something really fascinating. Honestly, a complete masterclass in high-stakes geopolitics. We're going to walk through a super comprehensive analysis from the Sejong Institute looking at the Islamabad Memorandum. If you've been following this, you know this is the historic 14-article treaty that finally ended that grueling 107-day US-Iran war. The ripple effects of this document? They are going to absolutely reshape global security for decades. So we're going to unpack exactly how this treaty changes the game right now. Okay, let's look at our roadmap for this diplomatic assessment. We'll start with part 1, ending the 107-day war. Then, 2, inside the Islamabad Memorandum. 3, who benefited from the deal. 4, the winner's curse. And finally, 5, next stop, North Korea. So, part 1, ending the 107-day war. Let's trace exactly how this escalated, because the global stakes here were just immense. It all kicked off with those surprise US and Israeli airstrikes on February 28th. Then, literally just 2 days later, Iran retaliated by blockading the Strait of Hormuz. And wow, that functioned like an economic nuclear weapon. Fast forward to April 8th, they tried a ceasefire, but it failed. Finally, the sheer, exhausting global toll forced both sides to the table, leading to the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding on June 14th. Moving right along to part 2, inside the Islamabad Memorandum. This is where the abstract idea of, peace actually meets hard numbers. When this treaty was signed, boom, global oil prices instantly plummeted to $80 a barrel. This was a massive deal. That immediate, tangible relief basically averted a global economic depression and eased all those crazy market anxieties overnight. It was exactly the quick economic fix the international community was totally desperate for. But as we know, peace isn't free. The cost of that relief is buried right there in Article 6, which commits the U.S. and its regional partners to set up a staggering $300 billion reconstruction fund for Iran. Now, the analysis points out that the U.S. will probably lean heavily on private investment from Gulf states to foot that bill, but realistically, the fund functions as compensation for wartime damage. And to put that into perspective, it's expected to take a grueling 12 to 15 years just to rebuild. Then you have Article 13, which lays out a really strict phased approach. Step 1, Iran demanded that all blockades, all sanctions, and all frozen assets be addressed immediately. Only after every single one of those concessions is fully implemented do we even get to step 2, which is negotiating the highly sensitive nuclear issue. So yeah, that was a major structural victory for Tehran's negotiators, for sure. But you know what's really wild? It's what is not in the document. The Sejong report heavily emphasizes these glaring omissions. There is absolutely no mention of restricting Iran's medium-range ballistic missile program. None. There's also zero requirement for Iran to end its support for proxy forces, groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon or the Houthis in Yemen. The Institute notes that failing to secure concessions on these 2 specific fronts leaves U.S. allies in the region incredibly vulnerable. All right, part 3. Who benefited from the deal? To figure this out, the Sejong Institute actually built a scorecard, objectively evaluating the final treaty line by line to declare a strategic winner. And according to their analytical matrix, the treaty overwhelmingly favors Iran. Out of the 16 key provisions and omissions they evaluated, Iran secured the more favorable outcome in 13 of them. From the comprehensive sanctions relief to those phased negotiations that delay the nuclear talks, the entire structure of the deal aligns almost perfectly with Tehran's initial demands. And, as you might expect, this lopsided outcome sparked a massive domestic backlash within the United States. The report impartially highlights this widespread criticism across U.S. media and politics. Even the New York Times editorial board bluntly called the war a mistake. They flat out stated that the U.S. is emerging weaker across the board, militarily, diplomatically, economically, basically framing the whole treaty as a clear strategic defeat. Which brings us to part 4, the winner's curse. So how exactly did a global superpower find itself accepting a deal like this? Well, the report attributes it to a fascinating strategic phenomenon called the winner's curse. It's what happens when a brilliant tactical advantage is overused until it totally exhausts the user. Think of it like having a knockout punch, but swinging so hard and so often, you pull a muscle and can't fight anymore. The U.S. counter-blockade was initially a masterstroke, right? Highly effective. But by relying on it to try and force complete submission, the U.S. essentially exhausted its own political, military, and economic capacity to sustain the war. The real tragedy, according to the analysis, happened on April 17th.
On this specific date, Iran actually offered to unilaterally lift its blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Had the U.S. just reciprocated, they could have locked in a much, much stronger diplomatic position. Instead, actually, the U.S. declined. They doubled down on a maximum pressure campaign known as Operation Economic Fury. The Sejong Institute points out that missing this crucial diplomatic window is exactly what forced the U.S. to accept a much less favorable deal months down the road.
Finally, Part 5. Next up, North Korea. We have to look at the ripple effects here, because the benchmark for diplomatic success has now completely shifted. Because the U.S. effectively allowed Iran to maintain its vast stockpiles of enriched uranium just to end the fighting, the author assesses that future talks with North Korea are going to follow the exact same script. That long-stated goal of complete denuclearization, it'll likely devolve into mere arms control, tacitly accepting North Korea as a permanent nuclear state. So, I want to leave you with this incredibly provocative warning raised by the report. If the United States compromised its own allies' security, like failing to restrict Hezbollah and ballistic missiles for Israel just to end a war with Iran, what does this new reality mean for South Korea? The author argues, quite bluntly, that South Korea must urgently prepare a contingency plan B for a world where complete denuclearization never actually materializes. It's a pretty sobering thought, right? But it perfectly highlights why understanding the mechanics of these treaties is so absolutely vital. Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer, and keep questioning the world around you.